Hello and welcome to our Art and Architecture webinar series. I'm Kurt DiCamello, the Curator of Fine Art at American Ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We're the oldest and largest genealogical society in the world. We specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise that uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Now we're in for a real treat. For the first time in its 111-year history, Historic New England has gathered 45 of its most intriguing paintings and installed them in an exhibition at the Eustis Estate in the town of Milton, just outside Boston. On view until the fall of 2021, Artful Stories, Paintings from Historic New England, offers a rare opportunity to experience these artworks in museum-style galleries, quite unlike their normal settings at Historic New England's 38 historic properties and in its collection storage facility. Today, the paintings come together to reflect sometimes significant, surprising aspects of the region's intellectual and cultural life over the last 3 centuries. Co-curators Nancy Carlisle and Peter Trippi developed Artful Stories over more than 3 years and will share some of the discoveries they made while exploring and researching this exciting project. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. I also want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording on our website that you can watch at any time. Nancy Carlisle, a graduate of the famous Winter program in early American culture at the University of Delaware, has been a curator at Historic New England for more than 30 years. She's been involved in the opening and reinterpretation of numerous H&E properties, including the Spencer Pierce Little Farm, Cogswell's Grant, Castle Tucker, and Quincy House, and in the development of traveling exhibitions promoting historic New England collections. Nancy is also the author of a number of books, including the award-winning Cherished Possessions, A New England Legacy. Her co-conspirator, Peter Trippi, is the editor-in-chief of Art Connoisseur, the national magazine that serves collectors of contemporary and historical realist art. He's also president of Projects in 19th Century Art, a firm he established to pursue research, writing, and curating opportunities. Based in New York City, Peter has directed the Deheesh Museum of Art and co-curated international touring exhibitions devoted to the 19th century painters J.W. Waterhouse and Lawrence Alma Tadema. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Nancy and Peter.
Thank you, Kurt. That's a lovely introduction. Peter and I are delighted to join you and your audience today and to share some of the highlights in Artful Stories. Thank you also to Geneva for working behind the scenes to make sure the technology behaves. As Kurt said, the exhibition is drawn from the collections of Historic New England. And for those of you unfamiliar with us, we're the nation's oldest and largest regional preservation organization with, as Kurt said, 38 historic properties, which are open to the public, in 5 New England states. They range from 17th century stone enders like the Arnold House in Rhode Island to this wonderful riverfront Georgian property with its amazing colonial revival gardens above the Salmon Falls River in Maine. We have the iconic modern masterpiece designed by Bauhaus founder Walter Gropius and lived in by Gropius and his family until it came to us in 1984. And we also own the lifelong home of author Sarah Orne Jewett. Both homes have original family furnishings, as indeed do almost all of Historic New England's properties. At the 17th century Spencer Pierce Little Farm, one of the stories we tell is that of the Lithuanian family who farmed the property and lived in the tenant farmhouse for most of the 20th century. With so many historic homes filled with original furnishings, there are literally hundreds of paintings. The Codman house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, about which we'll talk more shortly, was lived in by multiple generations of the Codman family, many of whom collected art, and indeed 8 of the 47 artworks in the exhibition came from the Codman house. Nearly half the paintings came from Historic New England storage facility in Haverhill. These came into the collection over the years, either as individual gifts or from deaccession properties. And you can imagine what a wonderful opportunity it was to have a chance to pore over the paintings collection. And it was even more of a joy to have a chance to work with Peter, whom you'll be hearing from shortly. The exhibition came about because of this house, one of the most recent properties to come into our holdings. It's an aesthetic masterpiece by the architect William Ralph Emerson. And while the first floor is furnished to complement the building's design, 4 bedrooms on the second floor have been converted to galleries. And you can see here the outside of the first gallery where we have the introductory panel. For the rest of this program, Peter and I will walk you through some of the highlights in each gallery. Peter will talk about the first and fourth galleries, while I take the second and third. And now, Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Nancy. It's great to be back with you, if only virtually, and such a delight to see these beautiful rooms again. I'm looking forward to being back there at Milton in June. And thank you again to American Ancestors and the whole team for welcoming us so warmly. This slide shows Gallery 1, as you can see, Land and Sea. Just as the name suggests, this opening section explores the physical geography that has shaped the region. You can get a sense of the variety of scales of paintings on view in the room. I'd like to move to one of my favorites in the room, which is a portrait, if you will, of a farm. This is the farm of Ezekiel Hersey Derby in Salem, Massachusetts, painted by a European immigrant artist named Cornet. This was made about 1800, and it is very much a symbol of pride. This man, Mr. Derby, was well known as a brilliant farmer. He was a trustee at the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture, which was founded in 1792, and very much represents the Enlightenment in the sense that scientific principles of farming were being put forward. Now, today, it seems pretty obvious that you would want to do deep plowing and work in an orderly manner and use manure as fertilizer, but at that time, it was not so evident. So Derby was out in front, proving that these techniques worked. And here we see peace and order in the countryside. I think you'll agree it looks very prosperous indeed. Here we also might notice these marvelous stone walls that are lining the road. This is a reminder that comes up again and again in almost all of the paintings in this gallery. We have to remember that much of New England was formed by glaciers, and so the freeze-thaw cycle often will bring boulders up to the surface year after year. It's a bit of a nightmare for farmers, but here Derby has made a virtue out of those marvelous stones. We're going to move on to remember that historic New England today is very much interested in the ongoing significance of farms and farming life. These are 2 properties of several in the system of historic New England that are devoted to showing the public how it was to farm in New England. And so it's nice to see that link between the historical Cornet painting and the present as we move around New England visiting historic New England properties. There's also, of course, the sea to think of, as the title of the gallery suggests. There's no question that New England's economic success depended on sailing vessels like this one. Proud ship owners throughout the region were commissioning vast numbers of, again, what I call a portrait here. It's a portrait of a beloved possession, a marvelous sailing ship. This ship, unnamed, unfortunately, is depicted here at Boston Harbor, specifically at Nix's Mate, which is a tiny island identifiable by the marker at right. One flag on the ship tells us that a harbor pilot has come aboard to help the captain either enter or exit the harbor, and there is a tugboat bobbing in the foreground, as we can see. Curtis is a very fine painter of maritime life, and so he shows debris floating in the water, first of all, to remind us that this was very much a working harbor. It was not necessarily the cleanest body of water, but also that debris drives our eye deeper into the scene so that we get engaged by what's happening. We did consult some experts in historical shipping, and we were interested to learn that the figures on the deck are actually positioned just a bit too high relative to where they really would have stood. The deck would have been a bit lower, but I think the artist here was probably having a bit of fun so that we could get a sense of how gigantic this ship is. It's a much more interesting picture as a result of his choice. So we think now of turning our back from the water toward New England's growing cities. And here we have a fine example. It's a picture by Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow depicting Boston at an earlier stage in its life. If we look more closely at the picture itself without that beautiful frame, what we see here is the city of Boston. We're looking west from Winthrop, probably from Point Shirley. And what we have here in the distance is the skyline of Boston. You might be able to pick out the dome of the Massachusetts State House or the steeple of the Park Street Church. These are familiar landmarks even today. Now, the land that we see between that skyline and us, where a man seems to be walking his dog, that area in the 20th century was filled up, these were flats, filled up with landfill to create the area that has become Boston Logan International Airport. So hopefully that will help orient you to where we are. Now, Longfellow is a very fine artist, and he's used trees in the foreground, again, to draw our eyes into the composition, trees and foliage. And of course, the real star here is that enormous sky overhead, which underscores the flatness below. It is very much a picture influenced by, originally, that would be Dutch Old Master painting, because of course the Netherlands is so flat, and then more recently paintings that this artist would have seen in France. He knew exactly what was going on, which leads me to point out something about him, the painter himself. This is a photo of Ernest Longfellow in his studio at Coolidge Point in the North Shore. You can see what a distinguished looking gentleman he was. It may not surprise you that he was the son of the famous poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and that he grew up in Cambridge, attended Harvard, studied art in France, and traveled widely. You get a sense of that from that marvelous Egyptian scene, the largest picture hanging on the wall behind him. This is a custom-built studio. This artist had the best of everything when it comes to materials, and I love the fact that he's posing in his fine suit. He probably didn't paint in that lovely suit. This was a man who was privileged, but certainly appreciated his privileges. Now, by contrast, someone that we're going to talk about next is someone who really had to fight his way to the top of the art world in New England at roughly the same time. I'm showing you first here, just as a placeholder, this marvelous painting in our collection by Edward Mitchell Bannister. We'll come back to the detail of the picture in a moment, but I just want to talk a bit about him, if I may. He was a fascinating man. Bannister was one of the few Black artists to be widely recognized in the United States before 1900. He was born in Canada, and in 1853, he became a barber in a Boston salon owned by a woman called Christiana Carteau. She was a prosperous entrepreneur whom he later married. It was her financial success that allowed him to pursue art studies on his own, because unfortunately racism prevented him from studying in an art school. Just to set some context here, in 1867, there was an article in the New York Herald that stated, quote, "The Negro seems to have an appreciation of art, but is manifestly unable to produce it." This was a sweeping generalization from a writer in that paper, and I would like to think that Bannister was devoted to the idea of proving him wrong. In fact, Bannister succeeded brilliantly from the 1860s onward through his sheer talent and hard work, and I'm showing you here an image of the opening day festivities at Philadelphia, the Great World's Fair, 1876. When Bannister arrived to investigate to see if he had won any kind of prize at the fair, he was refused entry, but basically he had won a great medal, a gold medal, and it was essentially going to be taken away from him because they suddenly realized that he was not white. Fortunately, the other exhibitors protested that decision, and he did indeed receive the medal and the prize. So that's at least somewhat pleasing. Now let's move to the work of art itself. It's a real jewel, although it's quite tiny. In Boston during the 1850s, Bannister would have very much been looking at Barbizon painting. That was a style of landscape art that had arrived from France just that very decade through interesting artists like William Morris Hunt. In contrast to the meticulous detail and the strong coloring employed by the then fashionable Hudson River Valley school, the Barbizon artists were using more tonally unified coloring, looser brushwork, and softer forms. And I think you can get a sense of that here, even though this picture is from the 1880s rather than the 1850s. The style stuck, as you might guess, all the way up to 1900. These kinds of Barbizon or tonalist pictures were very much prioritizing nature's ordinary beauties over iconic, majestic views. And so here we see a very simple scene. It's worth pointing out that Bannister taught at the Rhode Island School of Design and co-founded the Providence Art Club. He and his wife had moved to Providence, and he became quite the celebrity there, much beloved by anyone interested in culture at that time. Very often he would take his art students, both men and women, outside Providence to paint and sketch outdoors. And so what we see here may well be one of his students or perhaps a hired model posing under the tree, seemingly reading. And I think you'll agree that this is masterfully composed with a progression of shadow and sunlight and then shadow again. We are drawn into the picture by that composition, but also by the screen of trees that run vertically across the picture. This truly epitomizes the transcendentalist belief in the unity of nature and people, but in a very different way from what earlier generations had done in their landscape art. So I'm going to hand over to Nancy to talk about Gallery 2.
Thank you, Peter. It's always such a pleasure to hear your interpretation of these paintings. It's been such a great partnership because we have very different knowledge base and very different approach. So it's a pleasure. The second gallery, as you can see, is devoted to the home in New England. As a preservation organization with multiple historic houses, life in the home is very much in our wheelhouse. And in fact, here we see two paintings that are in the gallery. But I also want you to pay attention to the photographs, because since our founding in 1910, we've been collecting not only houses, but historic photographs of the interiors of homes. And today these number close to 5,000 images, many of which you can see on our website. While we have far fewer paintings of domestic interiors, these are especially prized. And as you can see, we have two here. This charming example shows the parlor of the Cushing house in Hingham, Massachusetts. It was painted during a summer visit by the amateur artist Ella Emery, who came with her niece, Alice Cushing, who you can see here, to visit their family's homestead in 1878. The house was built by Cushing family members about 1678, 200 years earlier, and updated over the years by multiple generations who, among other improvements, boxed in the summer beam and added a corner cupboard. In 1878, the furnishings ran the gamut of a federal clock and mirror to a more recent white hide rug. And the kittens, we're told, were known as Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Remarkably, the Cushing family still owned the house when then owner of the painting, folk art collector, and inveterate researcher Nina Fletcher Little went to visit in 1957. By that time, what had been the west parlor had been transformed into the dining room, and the cased summer beam had been faux painted. But she found many of the parlor's 1870 furnishings scattered in other parts of the house, and it was from an elderly family member that she learned the names of the two kittens. This painting of a domestic interior is a fairly new addition to Historic New England's collections, and I was delighted that we were able to include it in the exhibition. I love it in part because it shows a woman working. Far more often, women are shown in paintings being decorative, often sitting in a chair reading. And in fact, in the gallery near this painting is just such a painting, as well as the actual chair that the woman is shown sitting in. But here we see a woman accustomed to work. The curvature of her spine and the muscles of her arms a testament to years of physical labor. I was especially pleased when Peter and I looked at it together and he pointed out that this was the work of an accomplished artist. For instance, in the handling of multiple round forms seen from various angles, but all of them in perfect perspective. This played into one of the topics we wanted to include in the exhibition. We wanted a way to guide visitors to understand how the painter accomplished his or her work. So for some of the paintings, there's a, quote, learning to look section that can be seen in kiosks in the gallery or on our website, and that uses hotspots to talk about specific features of the painting. In this case, color, perspective, light and shadow. But the main reason I wanted to include this painting is that it's a rare view of a kitchen. A few years ago, I worked on an exhibition and book on the history of the kitchen, and one of the things I learned is that there's an ongoing tension in kitchen history between the room as a workspace and the room as a social space. And here you can see the two extremes. The painting shows a room that's set up to be used solely as a workspace. When the family gathers, they do so elsewhere, perhaps in the room just beyond the open door. The modern kitchen, on the other hand, is clearly designed as a social space. As a workspace, it's too large, and the island acts as a barrier for moving between the refrigerator and the stove. Instead, the room is designed for people to enjoy spending time together. And the history of the kitchen design is one of a pendulum swing between these two extremes. And here we see quite a different space. This is the family home in Boston's Back Bay of the interior designer Henry Davis Sleeper. Sleeper's seen in youthful elegance, surrounded by leather-backed books, an ivory figure under glass, with his hand draped on a gilded table. Whether he or the artist determined that his tie should be matched to the vase and the chair, the image clearly depicts a glamorous aesthete. The painting was completed the year before Sleeper began to build his now famous summer home, Beauport, on Gloucester's eastern point. Begun in 1907, Beauport became Sleeper's calling card as an interior designer. And of course, it's now open to the public as one of Historic New England's most popular homes. Sleeper added to the house in a number of building campaigns until by 1925, what began as a small English cottage had been expanded to a show house of more than 40 rooms. His innovative approach to the Beauport interiors, where he used historical material to create what were essentially theatrical, moody stage sets, did not go unnoticed. His work was published in House Beautiful in 1916 and in Country Life in 1929. For the illustrations for Country Life, Sleeper commissioned the artist William Rankin to paint 12 of his rooms, both at Beauport and at his home in Boston. And here you can see how Rankin captured the play of light in the room and Sleeper's use of recurring greens and reds. The corner cabinet is filled with his collection of Paul Revere silver, which, much to our regret, he later donated to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. But otherwise, the house and its collections remained largely intact until it came to Historic New England in 1941. Eastern Point in the early years of the 20th century was the home of a summer community who loved to entertain. And here you can see staff at Beauport preparing a festive meal, as well as a group including Sleeper in the center and his friend A. Piatt Andrew to the right at a dinner party at Piatt Andrew's home, 2 houses down from Sleeper's. And indeed, knowing the house would be used for entertaining, Sleeper created not 1, not 2, but 7 dining rooms in the house, each one evoking a different mood, from the expansive golden step room on the left to the more intimate octagon room on the right, with Sleeper's collection of red toll brought back from France after his service during the First World War. And now we'll move from the second gallery to the third, devoted to portraits depicting a range of New Englanders. And I have to say, I wasn't convinced that we should have a gallery of portraits in the exhibition, but it turned out to be the most personally moving for me. As you would expect in a gallery of portraits of New Englanders, there's always a painting of a seated gentleman in a black coat with a white ruff at his throat, and here's ours. This is John Codman, whose house we saw earlier. And while he didn't contribute substantively to the paintings at the Codman collection, his brother was the collector, it was he who really contributed to the building of the house itself. When he first knew it, it was a substantial Georgian pile, as you can see in the model, and it originally belonged to his in-laws, who left the house and a considerable fortune to John Codman's underage son, Charles Russell Codman. John Codman used his son's wealth to transform the property into the mansion largely as we know it today. I would say that Charles Russell Codman, I think in a fit of pique, sold the house out of the family once he came of age, and it came back in a subsequent generation. The portrait was painted by John Singleton Copley, America's most successful 18th century portraitist, who moved from Boston to London on the eve of the Revolution to further his artistic career. But Copley knew the Codman house. He had visited it when he was commissioned to paint a portrait of Dr. Charles Russell in the 1760s. According to legend, when Copley visited the house, the Russells offered him a glass of wine, but after a fruitless search, they realized they had no corkscrew. And Copley said he could provide one and proceeded to paint a corkscrew on an interior door. In the 20th century, the Codmans cut the painting from the door, much to our regret, and donated it to the MFA, where it's on view now in the American wing. It's always hard to choose favorite items, favorite houses, favorite objects, but I have to say, without question, this is one of my favorite paintings in the exhibition. And yet it's a copy instead of an original of V.G. Lebrun's famous self-portrait. It's a painting in our collection that I've always been interested in, perhaps because Lebrun's painting was on the cover of Germaine Greer's 1979 feminist art history, The Obstacle Race. And I was learning about art history in graduate school in 1979 and 80. And the book is about why more women haven't succeeded as artists. Our painting, our copy, is slightly larger than the original, but as I think you can see, it's a very good copy. It was painted by a woman named Elizabeth Adams, about whom we knew absolutely nothing when we began this project. We've since learned that she was from a progressive Boston family who sent their daughters to a school founded by George Beryl Emerson. And coincidentally, Emerson is the grandson of the woman in the next portrait I'm going to tell you about. Emerson founded the first school in America to teach the same curriculum to girls that was traditionally offered to boys. And he taught his students to believe that they had the right to have a professional career. I'm sure many of his students did not, but Elizabeth Adams took this to heart and was determined to become a painter. But at the time, this is the 1850s, there were no classes in America available for women who wanted to train to be fine artists. Instead, Adams, whose family wealth enabled her to travel, headed to Paris. And there she likely paid twice as much for her classes as male students and received half the attention. Aside from classes, another way artists learn to paint then as now is by copying. And here you can see a scene in the Louvre recorded by the American inventor and artist Samuel Morse in the 1830s, with men and women copying important paintings. And notice the Mona Lisa just to the right of center on the bottom row of paintings. And curiously enough, no one seems to be copying that. Adams also spent some of her 11 years abroad in Florence, where the Vasari corridor had recently opened to the public. The Vasari corridor was hung with self-portraits of Europe's most distinguished artists. Only those invited by the Uffizi were allowed to submit self-portraits. It's easy to picture Adams walking down the gallery, pausing before paintings by Rembrandt, Velázquez, and Delacroix, looking for examples to copy. When she came to Vigée Lebrun's self-portrait, which still hangs at the Uffizi, she must have recognized a kindred spirit. And while she never reached the heights of Vigée's career, the quality of Adams's work was affirmed when one of her paintings was accepted for exhibition at the Paris Salon of 1885. Clearly, this portrait was especially meaningful for her, for she brought it back from Europe, placed it in an expensive frame, and left it to her nephew, from whom Historic New England received it in 1937. And finally, I'm showing you one of the walls in the third gallery, which had a surprisingly profound effect on me once I saw it, even though Peter and I had planned the arrangement and knew it was going to happen. The painting at the center is a portrait painted in 1761 of Sally Seward Barrell by the English portrait artist Joseph Blackburn, who painted the well-to-do in Bermuda, Boston, and Portsmouth before returning to England. It's a painting that I know well, for it's long been one of Historic New England's treasures, not only because of the quality of the painting, but because of its history. It came to us as part of the furnishings of the Seward Wheeler House, which was donated to Historic New England by Seward descendants in 1977. And the house may be the most intact 18th century home in America, retaining many of its 18th century furnishings. And indeed, what's remarkable about the portrait is that it usually hangs in the same spot where it has hung since 1761, on the only wall in the house large enough to accommodate it, adjacent to portraits by an unknown artist of the sitter's father and mother. In the exhibition, it hangs between these two portraits. The first, an imagined portrait of Cyrus Bruce, and the second of Isaac Manchester of Bristol, Rhode Island. Cyrus Bruce was the formerly enslaved man who worked for Governor John Langdon following the Revolution. He was particularly known and written about in the local newspaper for his dignity and his dress. And indeed, that's how the contemporary Black artist Richard Haynes has portrayed him. Isaac Manchester started his life as a sailor and soon became a wealthy ship owner, in no small measure because of his willingness to transport enslaved Africans. Slave ship captains were the worst of the worst in the slave economy, and Bristol, Rhode Island was at the center of that economy. Even after the trade was outlawed by the federal government, it continued for several years. Finally, with the end of the slave trade, the town of Bristol went bankrupt. Manchester himself died in poverty on the eve of the Civil War, listed not as a mariner, but as a lowly laborer. For some reason, unexpectedly, seeing Sally Seward Barrell between Cyrus Bruce and Isaac Manchester has transformed my understanding of her and her life. Where once I saw a lovely woman of leisure, I now understood more clearly that others paid the price for that leisure, for we know that there were at least 3 enslaved workers at the Seward family's home. And where once I saw her as a charming young woman, for me that smile of hers has turned unattractive. And while I know that as historians it is usually inappropriate to evaluate historic figures through a contemporary lens, this is a case where I believe it's completely appropriate. And with that, I'm happy to turn to nicer things and to turn things over to Peter.
Thank you, Nancy. That's very profound. It still moves me every time I hear that account. The final gallery in the exhibition is number 4, The Wide World, as you can see here on the screen. This is a section which explores New England's connections to other places, ranging all the way from Niagara Falls to China. It goes without saying that New Englanders have always been on the move, partly due to their great seafaring and trading skills. So we're going to take a closer look at some of the more interesting pictures in the show, in this section. This is a photograph, not in the exhibition per se, but certainly on the website and on the educational kiosk in the room. This is a photo, as you can see, of the great Professor Charles Elliot Norton. He was well known then in his day, and certainly even now his name resonates. He was a humanities professor at Harvard, editor of the North American Review, founder of The Nation, and frequent contributor to the Atlantic Monthly, certainly one of the leading minds of his generation. Well, he had a fascinating family, as you might expect, and one of them was his daughter, Sarah, or Sally Norton. This is a girl who was very much like her siblings at the center of New England's privileged intellectual class, but she certainly made the most of it. Here she's holding her violin. This is something that she began studying not in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but in Germany during one of her family's grand tours. So this was certainly, as I said, a privileged family, but gifted in many ways. I love the fact that this portrait is made by the great Pre-Raphaelite painter Edward Burne-Jones, about whom I've studied a great deal. He was a family friend of the Nortons, and it would seem that his children and those of the Nortons were very close, that they visited with each other as their parents did. Here on this slide, we see Sally off to the left. We see Margaret Burne-Jones, the daughter, in the middle. I think you'll notice how very similar the girls look. Now, let me just say that over on the right, we have that photograph showing two of the Norton girls, Sally and Lily, surrounding Margaret Burne-Jones. So we have an account, if you will, of their actual appearance. But let's face it, Burne-Jones had an idealized type of feminine beauty, and he sort of transferred that from one head to the next. And I think I could bore you with other images from other museum collections that verify that point. Nonetheless, these are beautiful and graceful looking women. It's also worth mentioning that the Norton family knew other fine, even famous artists in Europe. Another child of Charles Elliot Norton, Richard, or Dick, was painted by Antonio Mancini, the great Italian artist, and that picture also hangs in our exhibition. So we're very lucky that the Norton family has been so generous to historic New England. This is truly a circle of friendship that we're looking at here, and it's a reminder that the connections with England were especially close. But now I'd like to turn, if I may, to France. That's another direction in which many New Englanders moved. Here I'm showing you, first on the left, overview of this marvelous picture, Dreams of the Past. On the right, you see an image of Jean-Georges Vibert. He may not be a familiar name today, but believe me, he was world famous in the late 19th century. He was a French academician who became well known not only for his art, which you're about to see more of, but also for the pigment he invented, Vibert's red. And I think you'll see why in just a second. These are two canonical examples of his work in American museums. And I think that's important that these pictures had made their way from France to America, even in the 19th century, because he was such a household name. Vibert personally resented the opulent wealth and political power of the Roman Catholic Church in France. So he often depicted scenes of richly dressed Catholic priests behaving badly. So just for example, in the New York picture at left, you see a prelate looking very longingly at the image of a topless female in what seems to be a painting on the wall. I guess he's visiting someone's house, and in fact we see a woman's hat and shawl on the sofa before him. On the right you see a prelate who's looking through shutters with his binoculars, presumably at something very pretty. So these are not especially flattering images of men who should be busy with prayer and helping the poor. It's important to stress that Vibert's feelings were shared by many Protestant people in Britain and the United States. And upper-class people, therefore, who could afford to buy paintings, often bought these paintings. I'm not saying that they're hateful. They are always painted with a bit of a wink. There's an element of whimsy, but the point remains that this is not exactly the best use of money that's coming into the church's coffers. Now, if we look more closely at the painting that we have, which is large and marvelous and in superb condition, we see here there must be a bit of a backstory. We have a cardinal who is basically, he's fallen asleep. It seems like he's been rereading some old letters. He's holding a letter in his right hand, and thus the title of the picture, Dreams of the Past. There's a faint smile that's crossing his dreaming face, and then there's also that rather well-dressed demon standing behind him. He doesn't look like he's up to any good. His negative aspects are probably reinforced by that very big set of flames in the fireplace beyond. So sure enough, if we think about other visual culture at this time, we can imagine that that figure in red, V-Bear's red, by the way, would be Mephistopheles or some other sort of naughty demon. Here I'm showing you just two pictures that would have been very current at the time. First, an image by Delacroix, who was famous for depicting the story of Faust, Goethe's Faust, in which Mephistopheles essentially tricks Faust into doing awful things. And on the right, the operatic version by Gounod. Here you see exactly the same costume as worn by our demon. So chances are pretty good that this is what it's about. And this international language of, first of all, literature, and second of all, composition would have made a lot of sense to the buyer of the Vibert picture that we've got. So it's time to stay in France. In fact, this is a very different kind of picture from that country. After the Great Boston Fire of 1872 destroyed much of his real estate holdings, Ogden Codman Sr. moved his young family to the French seaside resort of Dinard in Brittany. So once again, we're seeing a Codman at play in that lovely resort town where many Americans and other foreigners gathered to be fashionable and to be comfortable. The Codmans met the artist Edward Darley Boyd and his wealthy wife, Mary Louisa Cushing, who had also moved from Boston to France and were inveterate travelers. Now, a few years later, when the Codmans returned to live in Massachusetts, this painting by Boyd came with them. We're not entirely sure if it was a gift from the artist or purchase, but that doesn't much matter. It is a recording of the harbor in this lovely town. The fact is that Boyd is a really interesting figure. We think about the fact that he was, if we can move to the next slide, please, well known to many Americans living in both Europe and the United States. This is a portrait of Boyd by John Singer Sargent, a dear friend of his. The two men were equally cosmopolitan. I also love this marvelous caricature on the right that was provided to us by a colleague at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston. As you can see, this is depicting Papa. The Papa is Edward Darley Boyd himself, and the picture is made by Julia Overing Boyd, his daughter. The reason the word daughter matters here is if we think about the name Boyd, I'll bet many of you know this marvelous portrait of those four girls by Sargent, the friend of the family. This, of course, hangs at the MFA Boston. And it seems to me that we're very grateful to Erica Hirschler, the curator at MFA, for participating in a conversation on Zoom with us recently to talk about the intersections between the historic New England paintings and those at the MFA. This is certainly one example of that. The fact is that Boyd may well be best remembered for producing such lovely daughters, but look at these marvelous images that he himself made. He was a very gifted artist, and he traveled widely because he could afford to and because he enjoyed it. But unfortunately, or not, he didn't really need to sell much art. And so the art didn't enter what you might call the ecosystem of the art world in quite the same way that his friend Sargent's did. So these pictures hanging occasionally at the MFA, where they are held, are just so revealing of this glamorous life that Boyd lived as he moved around Europe. So one more example of travel, a different country in this case, Italy. I'll zoom back to talk about this gorgeous frame in which the scene of Venice is housed, but I'd like to just praise Herman Dudley Murphy for this magnificent painting, truly one of the greats in the show. Looking here at this scene, we can probably agree that it's not really about Venice and its architecture, its gondolas, its blue poles. It's really about the impressionistic shimmer of water. This is a quiet or even poetic scene of a quiet area of Venice, not the busy Grand Canal teeming with gondolas and tourists. This is all about a kind of tonal harmony. It's less about reality than it is about the artist's interpretation of what he saw and what he felt. And it is so perfectly made. It just shimmers, truly, as you stand before it. Murphy was a fascinating figure. He was trained at the Boston Museum School. He spent 5 years studying in France. When he got home to Massachusetts, he became very much a beloved leader of the Boston arts community. But he did go back to Europe regularly, and in 1908, he revisited Venice and made this picture. I'd like to talk just a bit about the frame, because I think that actually matters a great deal in this case. Many of the frames in our show are stunning and also original to the pictures, but this one is truly the right one. This is one that was hand-carved for the artist for this picture. He was very much, he being Murphy, influenced, like so many of his generation, by Whistler, another Massachusetts man. And you see here on the left a great example by Whistler, where the frame has been designed by the artist to suit the painting inside. Again, we have these somewhat abstracted images of a city. It's transcendent. It is not in any way looking descriptive. Here we have the younger man, Murphy, following in the footsteps and going so far as to create a framing firm in 1903. He and Charles Prendergast founded the firm of Carrigrohane, which is named after the studio house that Murphy had created for himself in Winchester, Massachusetts, that same year. The fact is that that firm took off like a rocket and became enormously successful for the quality and beauty of frames like this, such that by 1915, Murphy turned it over to his friend, the art dealer Robert Vose. And of course, Vose Gallery survives today. So that is a lovely way to wind down the Wide World section. I thought I would add, before we sign off, that there are many ways to enjoy the exhibition and its contents, both by coming to visit us in Milton, Massachusetts, but also online. If you would visit, please, this website that you see listed at the top left, you'll find lots of information about Eustis Estate itself as a piece of architecture, as a home for a loving family, but also lots of details about every single painting in our exhibition, which runs right through October of this fall. There are many deeper dives on the website, including conservation treatment information about the frames and the fascinating backstories of the owners of the pictures. There's also, I'm glad to say, a 360-degree tour of the house. You can see the regular rooms that are not related to the exhibition, and also our exhibition picture by picture. Nancy showed you one little example of that earlier in the talk. And finally, we do hope that you'll join us on June 20. We're going to have cocktails with the curators. The weather certainly suggests it makes sense to be outdoors on the beautiful lawn of Eustis Estate, talking about this exhibition. We're going to celebrate Pride Month by focusing on LGBTQ artists and owners represented in the exhibition. So if you'd like to join us, please visit historicnewengland.org, and we'll see you next month. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Wow, Peter and Nancy, that really knocked my socks off. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Before we get to your questions, we have two upcoming art and architecture programs that I will be hosting that I would like to mention. The first one is on June 3rd, Boston's Oldest Buildings and Where to Find Them with Joe Bagley, who's written a book by the same name. And on June 18th, The Country Houses of Shropshire with Gareth Williams. Gareth, of course, for many of you, I think, on this call today, this broadcast will know, is sort of the authority for country houses in Shropshire, England's largest inland county. Now, let's get to your questions. Go ahead and type your query into the question panel, and we will answer as many of them as we can in the time provided. And I'm going to start off with one that just popped in, which is Nancy. Could you share the name of the book on kitchens that you mentioned?
Oh, I'd be happy to. It'll be easy to remember. It's called America's Kitchens, and it is available on Amazon still. So it was published, I think, in 2008 to a surprisingly open bibliography. There aren't many books that talk about the social history of the kitchen in America. And this covers not only New England, but the South and the Southwest as well.
You know, I remember years ago when I was taking a tour of the Otis house, the guide told us that the two greatest killers of women in the 18th and 19th century were childbirth and kitchen fires, which is pretty horrifying.
So I hope that we have trained our guides not to say that anymore. It turns out not to be true. So the fact of the matter is that women died in fires once they started wearing cotton, but that didn't happen until the 19th century. But in the 17th and 18th century, they were wearing linen and wool, which don't flame; they smolder. And
Oh,
so,
how interesting. Oh,
yeah,
that's great to know. Thank you so
yeah,
much.
yes, you're welcome.
Peter, someone asked, do you think that the Boyd Daughters is the greatest American painting of all time? I know that Erica Herschler thinks that, by the way, but
Yes.
what do you think?
I do love it very much. Absolutely. It certainly has to be in my top five. It is so extraordinarily well composed. It isn't just charming, it's also an incredible work of abstract art. And I think Erica has written very eloquently about that. So I dare not presume to paraphrase anything she's written. It is a joy to make that leap from that famous, well constructed painting over to the father of those charming girls, and to think about his own gifts and how much Sargent loved him, and how well they interacted on their travels. As we all know, Sargent was loving the experience of being outdoors painting abroad.
Thank you very much. The next one I have is for you. Does the Cushing house in Hingham still stand? I say you, actually. Obviously, there's only one you that I'm really talking about, and that has to be you, Nancy.
And the question is the Cushing house still standing? You know, I
That is,
have to
yes.
say, I wondered that myself as I was looking at that painting, and I don't know the answer to it. I suspect it is still standing. I suspect it's no longer in the family's hands, but I'm thinking that a virtual or real trip to the Hingham Historical Society is in order.
I agree. Nancy, while I have you, another question is, why do you think so many objects were given to the MFA rather than SPNEA or Historic New England?
Yeah, so actually, Peter mentioned the conversation that we had with Erica Herschler, and it was really terrific in so many ways because the organizations complement each other. And while the monuments of the fine arts went to the MFA, we were founded in part to offset that. And in fact, our founder in 1910 said in so many words that Historic New England would collect those things not given to the MFA. So the more day-to-day, the more commonplace items were designed to, or in his intent to come to us and be saved.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Oh, I did not mean to interrupt you. I'll just add, if I may, I'm delighted to say that that conversation with Erica, Nancy, and myself is available for free on YouTube if you visit the Historic New England channel and look for the Closer Encounters name. That's the name of our series of conversations related to this exhibition. Part 4, you'll find Erica Herschler.
Great, that's wonderful. Actually, and while I have you, Peter, another question is, the clouds in the Ernest Longfellow painting made me wonder if he had known Charles Harold Davis, often known as the clown painter of Mystic, Connecticut.
Well, what a wonderful question. That almost sounds like too good to be true. We have a marvelous Davis in the show that hangs in the same gallery, a very large picture. Believe me, I wish I could have talked about it, but we didn't want to keep you here all day. Yes, indeed. I would have to go back and look. Longfellow is of a slightly older vintage than Davis, but sure, the Boston art world was not enormous, and it's very possible that they had crossed paths. Davis, as you say, was the cloud painter until he decided not to be. And we have an iconic example set on a farm, almost certainly in or near Mystic, Connecticut, where he lived.
Wow. And then this is a question, I think, for both of you. Can you talk about some of the families represented in the exhibition and their impetus for collecting art? Obviously, we're assuming these families were upper class, so they could afford to collect art, and maybe what formed their strategies.
Absolutely.
Peter, shall I take a
Please,
go?
Nancy, go for it. Absolutely. Yes.
I think, I'll start with the Codmans and the Littles and leave the Nortons to you. The Codmans were collecting beginning at the time of the French Revolution, believe it or not, when Richard Codman was carrying out his brother's requests as a mercantile merchant in Paris at the time of the French Revolution, when houses were being disbanded and collections disbanded, and he was madly snapping them up to such a degree that his brother feared for the family's wealth and went over to bring him back forcefully.
Oh, I love that.
I know. But he and his nephew, John Codman's son, Charles Russell Codman, were passionate art collectors. And that carried on to the third generation with Ogden Codman Jr., who was himself a renowned interior designer. The other family that I'll mention were related to that Cushing house, and that was a painting that belonged to Nina Fletcher Little. She too came from a well-to-do family, but unlike most collectors of her generation, she really was interested in what she considered art of the more ordinary people. So she was an early collector of what today we consider folk art. She didn't like that term and called it something else, which I should know, but of course the word has escaped me. But anyway, so interesting, different approach taken by Nina Little than the Codmans, who are collecting the fine art of Europe.
Thank you very much. Peter, a number of people say that you clearly need to live in New England because you have a passion for it. What are you doing in New York City?
I'm slumming it. I'm definitely.
That's the right answer.
I am eager to get back to Massachusetts next month. I'm telling you, I've had so much pleasure on this project, and there's so much more to learn about the wonderful region and to see more of the properties of historic New England in the summer sunshine. So that will happen. If I may just ask one quick or add one comment about collecting families, the Nortons are especially interesting to me in the sense that my real passion would be 1880s, 1890s art, and especially that transatlantic flow between the United States and Britain. We probably are all aware that Charles Elliot Norton was a great advocate of the arts and crafts and brought a lot of that thinking over to the United States and especially to New England via his idols such as William Morris and of course Edward Burne-Jones, a partner of Morris. But I also would like to mention that in the exhibition, when you get there, or if you're visiting the website, please look for a work of art by a female artist, Marie Stillman. This is something that we had known about in the collection, but hadn't really looked closely at. And we're delighted to say that this too was collected by the Norton family. She was a second tier pre-Raphaelite. What I mean by that is not so much in terms of quality, but learning from that older generation. And she excelled at images of young women with that long red hair, those long slim fingers. And this is an iconic example which was not known to the experts on Stillman, and we're so glad to have it conserved and looking great in the show. That is another reminder of how advanced the Norton family tastes were and how lucky we are that a granddaughter of Charles Elliot Norton donated these marvelous things to historic New England.
Thank you. Peter, how would you compare the 19th century artists that you showed to their British contemporaries like Waterhouse that you studied?
Yes. I think that in general, the tastes reflected in New England collectors at this time were leaning more toward what you might call aestheticism and the arts and crafts, such as Marie Stillman or the Burne-Jones portrait, and not so much toward that luscious, slightly academic, neo-Italian effect that we see in the work of someone like J.W. Waterhouse. There is not much of a record of that kind of high academic work moving over to the United States. Those pictures were collected only sporadically in the U.S. and primarily, I might add, after 1970. So it's a whole different journey. Interestingly, for those who care, a lot of those high academic pictures by the likes of Waterhouse or Leighton went to Australia because Australia was so closely tied to Britain. There was a direct route from the Royal Academy summer exhibitions to Australian museums and private collections. So that's a whole different subject for another day.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. If you have further questions, you can email us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more programs for you and others to enjoy. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and our fabulous heritage tours, please visit americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you again in our future online programs. Goodbye for now.